Hey everybody, just getting myself warmed up a little bit here, getting everything positioned. I'm out here in the Mojave Desert. I know you see a house behind me. I have a friend out here that I wasn't expecting to make. I would have filmed this straight from the desert, but it's a little bit windy out here, so you wouldn't be able to hear anything. I'm hoping y'all can hear me right now. Hey Mom, can you hear me right now? I'm using my hands-free device on this one. All right, well, let me just say welcome everyone to bedtime, quarantine bedtime story time. This is gonna be volume 9. This is the Mojave edition. I'm out here in the Mojave Desert, surrounded by the Coso Mountains, the Sierra Mountains, the El Paso Mountains. It's truly gorgeous out here. You might be able to hear some birds behind me. I wish I could show you the desert, but you'll be able to see the sun setting around me. I don't want to say exactly where I am, but Mojave should be enough. I'm slightly stranded out here. Got a flat tire in the middle of the desert, but I'm in good company and I'm safe, healthy, and I'm hoping everyone out there is healthy. Of course, I'm very thankful for everyone who's tuning in now or in the future. Thank you for lending me your ears and your time. I'm very happy to be lending you my voice and my time. I've got a good selection today. I came out here for the quarantine, for some isolation, and well, it's really a beautiful place, and the desert is always more lively than it's made out to be, and anyone who comes out here realizes that. Let's go through the selection a little bit of what we have for the Mojave edition. There's a lot of the deserts here in California behind Los Angeles and out past the Central Valley, out past the Sierras, have long been used by the urban areas in California almost as like an industrial backwater, and you don't notice that till you actually see the Los Angeles aqueduct, for instance, or a lot of the big solar and wind fields. And there's pluses and minuses to all that, of course, and these authors discuss that. So I want to open up by reading a little bit of Edward Abbey. Any of y'all that have heard Edward Abbey before know the Monkey Wrench Gang. He's very much about maintaining the wildness of nature and the effect that has on our consciousness here. Definitely when nature is able to live, to be peaceful and not be disturbed by humans, it's better for our consciousness also. So I'm going to read the first chapter from Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey. Then I want to go a little bit into the prehistory here. This area has one of the highest concentrations of rock art, that's kind of a weird term, petroglyphs, pictographs. A lot of the indigenous groups that have been out here for upwards of 15,000 years or longer have been incising images on rocks. Most of them are very mysterious, but a lot of them are of the bighorn sheep. You can kind of see a picture here. I'm going to read an excerpt from this book. This is a pictograph site that's out here in the Coso Range, which is sacred to the Paiute Shoshone people out here. So I'm very thankful to have had a chance to hike around there and experience how sacred it really is. It's a volcanically active area. Part of it is protected by a naval base. I should say protected from people who try to deface this rock art and stuff like that. But not necessarily protected from them testing out bombs. So I want to read a little bit of the Archaeology of Ayers Rock in California, and this is by David Whitley, Tamara Whitley, and Joseph M. Simon. Here's the image again, just so you can see a little bit of the pictographs. I've been spending a lot of time out here chasing the bighorn pictographs and petroglyphs. There's a lot of hidden sites here of pieces of who knows if they're art or have ritualistic or other significance, but they're beautiful, they're very mysterious, they're all over the desert. And hopefully we can maintain them for a long time. And then lastly, I want to get into a chapter from The Destruction of California by Raymond. We're going to talk about the water wars in California and basically how Owens Valley Lake Mono, Owen's Lake, was drained of their water. Because that's very relevant to the desert. The desert out here in Eastern California was actually a lot more lively back in the day. It was very, some of it was some of the more lively deserts from around the world, and a lot of the way that water has been resourced from this area has turned it into what we think of a desert. And then I'm going to try and end with that Miwok story. But since we're out here, since we're talking about the contributions to California history that have been made here for a long time, I do want to start with a beautiful entry from Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey, who inspires us all to be a little bit rebellious against the forces that be that are trying to just turn nature into profit, because we know better than that. All right. So this first chapter is called The First Morning. This is the most beautiful place on earth. There are many such places. Every man, every woman carries in heart and mind the image of the ideal place, the right place, the one true home, known or unknown, actual or visionary. A houseboat in Kashmir, a view down Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, a gay Gothic farmhouse 2 stories high at the end of a Red Dog Road in the Allegheny Mountains, a cabin on the shore of a blue lake in spruce and fir country, a greasy alley near the Hoboken waterfront, or even possibly, for those of a less demanding sensibility, the world to be seen from a comfortable apartment, high in the tender, velvety smog of Manhattan, Chicago, Paris, Tokyo, Rio, or Rome. There's no limit to the human capacity for homing sentiment. Theologians, sky pilots, astronauts have even felt the appeal of home calling to them from up above, in the cold black outback of interstellar space. For myself, I'll take Moab, Utah. I don't mean the town itself, of course, but the country which surrounds it, the canyonlands, the slick rock desert, the red dust and the burnt cliffs and the lonely sky, all that which lies beyond the end of the roads. The choice became apparent to me this morning when I stepped out of a Park Service house trailer, my caravan, to watch for the first time in my life the sun come up over the bamboo stone of Arches National Monument. I wasn't able to see much of it last night. After driving all day from Albuquerque, 450 miles, I reached Moab after dark in the cold, windy, clouded weather. At park headquarters north of town, I met the superintendent and the chief ranger, the only permanent employees, except for one maintenance man, in this particular unit of America's national park system. After coffee, they gave me a key to the house trailer and directions on how to reach it. I am required to live and work, not at headquarters, but at this one-man station, some 20 miles back in the interior, on my own. The way I wanted it, naturally, or I'd never have asked for the job. Leaving the headquarters area and the lights of Moab, I drove 12 miles farther north in the highway until I came to a dirt road on the right where a small wooden sign pointed the way. Arches National Monument, 8 miles. I left the pavement, turned east into the howling wilderness. Wind roaring out of the northwest, black clouds across the stars. All I could see were clumps of brush and scattered junipers along the roadside. Then another modest signboard. Warning, quicksand. Do not cross wash when water is running. The wash looked perfectly dry in my headlights. I drove down across, up the other side, and into the night. Glimpses of weird humps of pale rock on either side, like petrified elephants, dinosaurs, Stone Age hobgoblins. Boy, I've had that feeling driving through Yosemite at night. Now and then something alive scurries across the road. Kangaroo mice, a jackrabbit, an animal that looks like a cross between a raccoon and a squirrel, the ringtail cat. It's like a civet cat. Farther on, a pair of mule deer start from a brush and bounded obliquely across the beams of my light, raising puffs of dust, which the wind, moving faster than my pickup truck, caught and carried ahead of me, out of sight into the dark. The road, narrow and rocky, twisted sharply left and right, dipped in and out of tight ravines, climbing by degrees towards a summit which I would see only in the light of the coming day. Snow was swirling through the air when I crossed the unfenced line and passed the boundary marker of the park. A quarter-mile beyond, I found the ranger station, a wide place in the road, an information display under a lean-to shelter, and 50 yards away, the little tin government house trailer where I would be living for the next 6 months. How nice. A cold night, a cold wind, the snow falling like confetti. In the lights of the truck, I unlocked the house trailer, got out bedroll and baggage, and moved in. By flashlight, I found the bed, unrolled my sleeping bag, pulled off my boots, and crawled in and went to sleep at once. The last I knew was the shaking of the trailer in the wind and the sound from inside of hungry mice scampering around, with the good news that their long, lean, lonesome winter was over. Their friend and provider had finally arrived. This morning I awake before sunrise, stick my head out of the sack, peer through the frosty window at the scene dim and vague, with flowing mats, dark, fantastic shapes looming beyond, an unlikely landscape. I grew up, moving about in long underwear and socks, stooping carefully under the low ceiling and lower doorways of the house trailer, a machine for living built so efficiently and compactly that there's hardly room for a man to breathe. An iron lung it is, with windows and Venetian blinds. The mice are silent, watching me from their hiding places, but the wind is still blowing, and outside the ground is covered with snow. Cold as a tomb, a jail, a cave, I lie down on the dusty floor, on the cold linoleum, sprinkled with mouse turds, and light the pilot on the butane heater. Once this thing gets going, the place warms up fast, in a dense, unhealthy way, with the layer of heat under the ceiling where my head is and nothing but frigid air from the knees down. But we've got all the indispensable conveniences. Gas cook stove, gas refrigerator, hot water heater, sink with running water, if the pipes aren't frozen, storage cabinets and shelves, everything within arm's reach of everything else. The gas comes from 2 steel bottles in a shed outside. The water comes by gravity flow from a tank buried in a hill close by. Quite luxurious for the wilds. There's even a shower stall with a flush toilet with a dead rat in the bowl. Pretty soft. My poor mother raised 5 children without any of these luxuries, and might be doing without them yet if it hadn't been for Hitler, war, and general prosperity. Time to get dressed again, to get out and have a look at the lay of the land, fix a breakfast, and fix a breakfast. I try to pull on my boots, but they're stiff as iron from the cold. I light the burner of the stove and hold the boots upside down until above the flame until they are malleable enough for me to force my feet into. I put on a coat and step outside, into the center of the world, God's navel, Abbey's country, the red wasteland. The sun is not yet in sight, but signs of the advent are plain to see. Lavender clouds sail like a fleet of ships across the pale green dawn. Each cloud, planed flat on the wind, has a base of fiery gold. Southeast, 20 miles by line of sight, stand the peaks of the Sierra La Sal, 12 to 13,000 feet above sea level, all covered with snow and rosy in the morning sunlight. The air is dry and clear as well as cold. The last fog banks left over the last night's storm are scudding away like ghosts, fading into nothing before the wind and the sunrise. The view is open and perfect in all directions except to the west, where the ground rises and the skyline is only a few hundred yards away. Looking towards the mountains, I can see the dark gorge of the Colorado River, 5 or 6 miles away. Carved through the sandstone mesa, though nothing of the river itself down inside the gorge. Southward on the far side of the river lies the Moab Valley, between the 1,000-foot walls of rock, with the town of Moab somewhere on the valley floor, too small to be seen from here. Beyond Moab Valley is more canyon and tableland, stretching away into the Blue Mountains 50 miles south. On the north and northwest, I see the Roan Cliffs and the Book Cliffs, the 2-level face of the Uinta Plateau. Along the foot of those cliffs, maybe 30 miles off, invisible from where I stand, runs the US 650, a major east-west artery of commerce, traffic, and rubbish, and the main line of the Denver-Rio Grande Railroad. To the east, under the spreading sunrise, are more mesas, more canyons, league on league of red cliff and arid tableland, extending through the purple haze over the bulging curve of the planet to the ranges of Colorado, a sea of desert. Within the vast perimeter, in the middle ground and foreground of the picture, a rather personal, demesne, are the 33,000 acres of Arches National Monument, of which I am now sole inhabitant, usufructuary, observer, and custodian. Boy, he's using some words I've never heard of. What are the arches? From my place in front of the house trailer, I can see several of the 100 or more of them which have been discovered in the park. These are natural arches, holes in the rock, windows in stone, no two alike, as varied in form as in dimension. They range in size from holes just big enough to walk through to openings large enough to contain the dome of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Some resemble jug handles or flying buttresses, others natural bridges, but with this technical distinction. A natural bridge spans a watercourse. A natural arch does not. The arches were formed through hundreds of thousands of years by the weathering of huge sandstone walls, or fins, in which they are found. Not the work of a cosmic hand, nor sculpted by the sand-bearing winds as many people prefer to believe. The arches came into being and continue to come into being through the modest wedging action of rainwater, melting snow, frost, and ice, aided by gravity. In color, they shade from off-white through buff, pink, brown, and red, tones which also change with the time of day and the moods of the light and weather and the sky. Standing there, gaping at the monstrous and inhuman spectacle of rock and clouds and sky and space, I feel a ridiculous greed and possessiveness come over me. I want to know it all, possess it all, embrace the entire scene intimately, deeply, totally, as a man desires a beautiful woman. An insane wish? Perhaps not. At least there's nothing else, no one human, to dispute possession with me. The snow-covered ground glimmers with a dull blue light, refleeting the sky with the approaching sunrise, leading away from me the narrow dirt road, an alluring and primitive track, into nowhere, meanders down the slope and towards the heart of the labyrinth of naked stone. Near the first group of arches, looming over a bend in the road, is a balanced rock about 50 feet high, mounted on a pedestal of equal height. It looks like a head of Easter Island, a stone god of a petrified ogre. Like a god, like an ogre? The personification of the natural is exactly the tendency I wish to suppress in myself, to eliminate for good. I am here not only to evade for a while the clamor and filth and confusion of the cultural apparatus, but also to confront, immediately and directly, if it's possible, the bare bones of existence, the elemental and fundamental, the bedrock which sustains us. I want to be able to look at and into a juniper tree, a piece of quartz, a vulture, a spider, and see it as itself, devoid of all humanly ascribed qualities, anti-Kantian, even the categories of scientific description. To meet God or Medusa face to face, even if it means risking everything human in myself. I dream of a hard and brutal mysticism in which the naked self merges with a non-human world, and yet somehow survives, still intact, individual, separate, paradox, and bedrock. Well, the sun will be up in a few minutes, and I haven't even begun to make coffee. I take more baggage from my pickup, the grub box, and cooking gear, go back into the trailer, and start breakfast. Simply breathing, in a place like this, arouses the appetite. The orange juice is frozen, the milk slushy with ice. Still chilly enough inside the trailer to turn my breath into vapor. When the first rays of the sun strike the cliffs, I fill a mug with steaming coffee and sit in the doorway facing the sunrise, hungry for the warmth. Suddenly it comes, the flaming globe, blazing on the pinnacles and minarets and balanced rocks, on the canyon walls, and through the windows in the sandstone fins. We greet each other, sun and I, across the black void of 93 million miles. The stone glitters between us, acres of diamonds almost painful to look at. Within an hour, all the snow exposed to the sunlight will be gone, and the rock will be damp and streaming. Within minutes, even as I watch, melting snow begins to drip from the branches of a juniper. Drops of water streak slowly down the sides of the trailer house. I'm not alone after all. 3 ravens are wheeling near the balancing rock, squawking at each other and at the dawn. I'm sure they're as delighted by the return of the sun as I am, and I wish I knew the language. I'd sooner exchange idea with the birds on Earth than learn to carry an intergalactic communication with some I'd just as soon exchange ideas with the birds on Earth than learn to carry on intergalactic communications with some obscure race of humanoids on a satellite planet from the world of Beetlejuice. First things first. The ravens cry out in husky voices. First things first. Blue-black wings flapping against the golden sky. Over my shoulder comes the sizzle and smell of frying bacon. That's the way it was this morning. That last paragraph is so funny to me. But it's a true sentiment. There's so much that has been known that is no longer known, and that has been unknown about the land we're on. And so there's always something here to discover. I'm not so sure that space is going to tell us as much about ourselves as we can learn from each other and from the land, from nature, and from the history of the land that we're on. That's why I read these stories. It's getting a little bit dark out here. I think I'm gonna try and turn on some lights, y'all. Please stay tuned. I'm very excited to share with you this book, The Archaeology of Ayers Rock. Let me just step away, but I'm gonna keep talking. As I was saying, out here in the Mojave Desert, there is a lot of Indian history, a lot of native rock art. Some of it is in the form of pictographs or petroglyphs. Some are stone circles that have been put together, different shapes in the ground. There's actually a park here in town where they talk about the different features of the petroglyphs, and it's really anyone who is interested in California natural history, but also just art history, needs to understand the art history here in California, the history that was here before Europeans got here. It's really astounding, and I think that a lot of not only does it have a development that is worth knowing in the same way, or even maybe more so because we're here than European art history, but it actually still informs our present. A lot of the aesthetics that we see in California still go back to what were native traditions and native things. A lot of people have probably learned a little bit in school in California, and we're lucky to have that in our curriculum, but there really is a lot of history that is hidden from the public and stuff. And if anyone ever has a chance to visit some of these petroglyph sites out here in Eastern California, there's also opportunities to talk to people from the tribes that are out here, because of course the people that made the rock art 15,000 years ago, they were related to the people who are still living here, and there has been a lot of cultural revival going on. Unfortunately, the U.S. government has taken this pandemic opportunity to kind of continue the colonial project and continue to mess with indigenous people in the Americas. So I'm hoping everyone listens here can not, when you're listening to me talking about people who lived here before and indigenous people that live here now, that you're also keeping in mind that there are things that we can continue to do to make sure that their voice is respected, and that we're not letting the government screw over indigenous people anymore. We're doing our best. Anyways, part of the way I understand these things is by trying to understand the art and the culture behind it, because we learn a very two-dimensional history in school. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the ethnographic history background of how Owens Valley and the Mojave Desert transitioned from basically like an art-filled place of plenty into an industrial backwater with the coming of European people. So this book is called The Archaeology of Ayers Rock. Ayers Rock is a beautiful archaeological site here. You'll find it if you look for it closely enough. I'm not going to tell you where it is. This is the ethnographic background. The Coso region, thus, should be understood as an area with great cultural continuity and time depth. While this suggests that the ethnographic picture of this region would be straightforward, in fact, such is not quite the case. Portions of the region instead fall essentially at the boundary between two Numic language branches, three of their distinct languages, and, for the Shoshone per se, between two distinct bands. For example, the Panamint Valley was predominantly occupied by Panamint or Coso Shoshone, the California Central Numic language, from about Ballarat northwards, and some admixture of Kawaiisu, the California Southern Numic language. Well, the Kawaiisu were the predominant but not exclusive residents of Ballarat from Ballarat southwards. Some Panamint Shoshone also being present. Meanwhile, Death Valley was itself occupied by representatives of three distinct Numic languages, the approximately northern one-third of the domain of the Panamint Shoshone. In the central Death Valley, around Furnace Creek, a mixture of Panamint Shoshone and Kawaiisu, and Southern Paiute, the Nevada Southern Numic language, purportedly lived. Southern Death Valley was apparently the domain of the Southern Paiute. Kawaiisu resided in central Death Valley, and Panamint Valley were known to the Shoshone as Punumunt, or in its Southern Paiute, Panamaitsiwi, from which the toponymic Panamint is derived. This term has been applied to the local geographic features as well as to the language and of the local resident Shoshones, who had villages in the Coso Hot Springs, Coso Cold Springs, Little Lake, and Olancha, thereby including the south shore of Owens Lake, and the northern Paiute apparently occupied most of Owens Valley and the lake northwards. Complicated though this may seem, it's recently been pointed out that due to low population density and band marriage exogamy, familial ties were quite widespread. The result was that while specific language and band territories might be fairly well defined, any given individual's ties to and association with the regional landscape were very broad and invariably exceeded the bounds of the band territory per se. This circumstance points to the fact that the territorial boundaries in this sense may be a Euro-American concept that had little direct bearing on the realities of indigenous lifeways. So what he's saying is there were a lot of peoples with slightly different cultures and different languages living throughout this area of California, and that complexity was too much for white people, Euro-Americans, to understand, so they tried to put them in boxes. But this is a very it's like a cultural mixing pot area in a very complex region, despite the sort of preconception that a desert is that people in the desert are predisposed to living a simpler life. There was a very rich cultural life here. Despite these issues in boundaries and locations and different languages, there were in fact great cultural similarities between the various Numic groups. We can then sketch the ethnographic lifeways of the area's inhabitants in general terms. Based on these and other sources, ethnographic lifeways in the region can be summarized as follows. As regards to subsistence, the Numic seasonal round involved alternating periods of aggregation into winter villages and then dispersal into nuclear families. Winter village aggregation was predicated on stockpiling the fall pinyon harvest, combined with rabbit hunting. Winter aggregation typically occurred at the major springs on the valley floor, where a band would congregate living in pit houses. In the Coso Range, there were 4 of these. Panamint Valley was so arid that it effectively had no winter aggregation sites. Even the historical rancheria and reservation at Indian Ranch in the northern part of the valley was only established once a well had been dug. So the indigenous people here lived all over the place, but some places were so bad that they didn't live there until they were forced there, essentially. Following winter aggregation, usually around April, nuclear families dispersed in the early spring, initially in search of ripening seeds and greens on the open alluvial fans. Seed collecting continued into the summer, with families moving to progressively higher elevations in search of ripening plants. By late summer, July through August, families were concentrated in the higher elevations of local mountain ranges. By early autumn, pinyon exploitation had begun, again at the higher elevations, with the return of the winter villages following the pinyon harvest. The seasonal round was completed. The Coso and Panamint ranges were exploited for seeds, roots, tubers, and pinyon nuts. Thus, these were primary areas exploited by diverse single-family groups during the summer and fall. Contemporary Timbisha Shoshone people residing in Death Valley continue to remember the quality of the pinyon nuts from the Coso Peak area. So there were very well-established lifeways, and people knew how to get healthy food. The social organization of the Numic has been a point of some controversy. Although it is clear that the regional bands and headmen existed during the historical period, Julian Stewart has argued that this was a recent development resulting from contact emanating from the need on the part of Euro-Americans to have a single Native American spokesman and leader with whom they would interact. Aboriginally and thus prehistorically, the Numic lacked any form of social organization whatsoever, with the biological nuclear family constituting the sum of group organization. This extreme position, of course, was necessary to substantiate his paradigmatic view of the Numic as a base-level stage for human social political evolution. That's some racism. In contrast, Stewart contended that Numic bands were the true Aboriginal organizational system and that they therefore had some prehistoric time depth. A recent reanalysis of the ethno-historical data combined with the relevant archaeological information suggests that the time depth of Numic bands and headmen is approximately 1,000 years. So of course, people had social organization and complex cultures. It was initially assumed that that wasn't there, and a lot of that was assumed to continue the racist agenda of taking land in the desert in Owens Valley. Specifically, now this is important for understanding the art. Specifically, this recent reanalysis shows that Numic religion and political organization were homologous, that band headmen were almost invariably shaman, and that headmanship and thus shamanism ran patrilineally in family lines. Moreover, it is apparent that historical bands and headmen were present in regions that Stewart claimed lacked them due to environmental limitations, such as the Coso, Panamint, Death Valley areas. On the archaeological side, it demonstrates that there was a significant intensification of shamanistic rituals, along with an increase in the logistical intensification and organization of the settlement and subsistence systems at approximately 1,000 years ago. Bands then were named for regional landholding groups that fell under the nominal leadership of a headman shaman. This individual was responsible for organizing and scheduling group subsistence activities such as rabbit drives and ceremonies such as the round dance. In his role as a shaman or healer, he conducted curing rituals. Although these were often viewed as primarily medicinal nature, in fact they serve as a form of social conflict resolution, in that they alleviated social disharmony and stress instead of providing pharmacological cures for perceived ailments. So, very complex social structures that were not only tending to people's most basic needs like food and shelter, but to their spiritual needs and their interpersonal needs for harmony. Regional Shoshone bands within the general area include the Coso, with the band territory known as Kuwiji, whose headman was, at least until 1874, Malarango, notably a historically documented fact overlooked by Stewart. Malarango is probably the origin of the local toponym Matarango Peak. Speaking of Matarango, that's the name of a museum here that works to protect the rock art in the area, so please check out the Matarango Museum when you have a chance. Another band that may have been present in northern Death Valley with Doc as headman in the historical period. Finally, a third band was composed of the Kawich Shoshone from Ash Meadows, western Nevada, whose territory may also have extended into Death Valley. It was a very complicated area. So I'm going to move on a little bit here because I want to talk about, or I want to get into the last part of this. Let's talk about the petroglyphs. The Numic shaman, known as a Pohagunt, man having power, was believed to acquire supernatural power during altered states of consciousness or trance experiences, typically induced through the ingestion of native tobacco, sensory deprivation, and extreme physical exertion. The initial acquisition of power, which was manifest in a spirit helper or animal tutelary, occurred at a vision quest site, Pohagani, House of Power, during the night. Following the acquisition of power and the termination of the altered state of consciousness, the shaman engraved or painted the vision he had received in order to preserve these images. These locales were sometimes revisited to renew the shaman's power and to enter the supernatural again, to manipulate the spiritual and material worlds. Rock art sites, accordingly, are shamans' vision quest sites, with the art itself depicting the trance experience of the supernatural. So the desert is a very special spiritual place, and it has been for thousands of years. As regards to the ritual, vision quest, and Numic symbolism, the region stretching from Charleston Peak through Death Valley and across the Panamints into the Cosos held a special place. It was known among the Chemehuevi and Southern Paiutes as Tiwi'i Nyarivipi, sacred land, mythic country, apparently referring to the fact that this region constituted the original Numic heartland, and that mythic events and occurrences therefore generally refer to features within this landscape. Moreover, this region, especially the Cosos, was associated with rain shamanism. Now this is really interesting here. Ethno-historical records, for example, demonstrate that local ethno-linguistic groups looked to the Panamint Shoshone and Kawaiisu as particularly potent rain shaman. And that shaman came to the Coso-Panamint region from distant areas to become weather control shamans and to make rain, even traveling from as far as northern Utah. Indeed, the last living Coso-Kawaiisu rain shaman, Bob Rabbit, traveled from his home in the southern Sierras in Kelso Valley to make rain in the Coso Hot Springs area. As is discussed below, his vision quest site is believed to be Ayers Rock. This is Ayers Rock right here, the pictographs that he did. The ethnographic record, moreover, then clarifies that the very large concentration of petroglyphs in the Coso region are arguably the largest concentration of rock art in North America. They are concentrated in this area because of its importance as a vision quest locale for Numic shaman, including rain shaman, with their large numbers resulting in the widespread Numic use of this region for vision questing. Moreover, the cause for the dominance of the bighorn sheep petroglyph in the regional corpus of art is then understandable. Now this is really interesting. The bighorn sheep were the specialized spirit helper of rain shaman. They are present in large numbers in this region because it was a nexus for rain shamanism vision questing. Following Numic symbolic logic further, the occasional depiction of human killing sheep are also then understandable. These did not result due to a bighorn sheep hunting cult or based on sympathetic hunting magic. This art wasn't just because they killed a sheep and decided to do art. Indeed, these motifs reflect a complex Numic metaphor for making rain. Rain shamans entered into an altered state of consciousness to supernaturally make rain. Their trances were metaphorically ascribed as death because of strong physiological analogies between altered state of consciousness and real dying. For example, loss of motor control and collapse, convulsions, diminished vital signs. The action of a shaman and his spirit helper were indistinguishable semantically, epistemologically, and linguistically. Thus, to kill a bighorn sheep was a metaphor for this shaman's auto-sacrifice, the ritual death he performed, the trance he entered to create rain. And one of the reasons, I don't know if it gets into this here, but one of the reasons why the bighorn sheep symbolize rain in this way is because the sound of two male bighorn sheep fighting, the clashing of the horns, made people think of thunder. So when these sheep are fighting in the mountains, it creates the sound of thunder and possibly beckons rain. So this animal became, because it carried the sound of thunder, became a spirit helper to the shaman. Just as Christian religious symbolize the acquisition of eternal life through the depiction of a crucified figure, and just as the Christian imagery has no relation with any kind of crucifixion cult, so did Numic religion link ritual death with the life-giving properties of rain without involving a hunting cult. Moreover, it is then apparent that Numic symbolic and cognitive systems were every bit as complex and well-developed as those of other comparative cultures, of course, as would be expected once their culture is viewed from outside the confines of 19th century evolutionary, aka racist thinking. This is social Darwinism theory, which has been widely debunked. Regardless of the specific purpose or function, the Numic rock art found specifically in the Koso region has appropriately been described as one of the most spectacular concentrations of rock art in North America, if not the world. It represents a high point in the intellectual and artistic achievements of Native American peoples, demonstrating the sophisticated symbolism and belief systems of the Numic, and thus countering the characterization of these people as exemplary of base level stage of human evolution. Indeed, the stark contrast between the richness of this artistic tradition and the seeming harshness of the surrounding natural environment is a signal that the intellectual and spiritual worlds of the Numic were in no way compromised by their residency in one of the hottest and driest areas in the continent. So maybe I'll read a little bit more, but this area really is covered in rock art. It seems like every canyon I go down, I'm seeing different images. Maybe they're art, maybe they're not, weren't intended as art. But please, I encourage everyone to look up the petroglyphs in Eastern California, in the Mojave Desert in the Eastern Sierra, at least to see online. This is part of our art history here in California, and as this author points out, it is an extremely complex and developed genre, you could say, of art or culture of art, that the more you understand it, the more you understand the people who have inhabited California for thousands of years, and the more you understand California itself, actually, as a land. This area kind of goes into the history of Owens Valley, but I think maybe we'll go to Dossman for that. Essentially, as this area was as the indigenous people in the Mojave and Owens Valley, Eastern California, were being devalued, dehumanized, and straight out murdered, the land out from under them was becoming more and more valuable, and this may have been one of the reasons that may have motivated a lot of the racism in California. On the bottom level of racism, there's a lot of hate. On the top level, someone is often profiting. So some people who are listening to this may have heard of the Owens Valley water wars, or the way that California got water from Lake Mono, from Owens Lake and further. If you have heard of that, a little bit about that, go ahead and share. You can share what you've heard, or share your feelings. I know that a lot of the people that I've met in Eastern California, or in the Eastern Sierra and in the desert, they have some resentment about it, because essentially Los Angeles, in their quest to bring water to LA, didn't do things the right way, and did a lot of shady things and a lot of corrupt things. So let's see, where am I starting here? This is The Destruction of California, which I read a little bit of. This book tracks the changes in California from when it began, or when people began to really tear apart the land for industrial purposes. California was a lot more beautiful at one point, but profit has been extracted from the land. Nothing that we can't undo, though, if we're conscious about it. So this is chapter 8 in The Destruction of California. The struggle for water. To what purpose is industrialization if we end up replacing rigid confinement of man's actions by nature with rigid confinement of man's actions by man? This is a quote from Harrison Brown. So at 1 o'clock on the morning of May 21st, 1924, the inhabitants of Lone Pine in Inyo County were shocked from their sleep by the blast of dynamite exploding nearby. Just outside town, concrete blocks were hurled into the air as a major spillway of the Los Angeles aqueduct was shattered. The rarest of California commodities, water, was poured out into the desert sand. An aerial observer might have noticed cars containing 40 or more erstwhile respectable citizens of Inyo County scattering from the scene of the explosion. The first blast of the Owens Valley War had occurred. During the following 3 years, the valley was to see continual strife. Heavily armed guards from the city of Los Angeles were to patrol its precious aqueduct. Machine guns were to be mounted at strategic points along the waterway. Legal battles were to rage in the courts. Again and again, the sound of high explosives would be heard as pipes, siphons, and spillways were blasted. Considering the quantities of firearms and explosives that were to be involved, it is surprising that no actual bloodshed took place. It was often threatened. The damage to property ran high. The Owens Valley battle was the closest thing to a shooting war to develop during the long struggle for water in which California had been engaged. It was perhaps the most unsavory episode in a conflict that has brought out some doubtful aspects of human behavior. The basic issue in this conflict is one that has not yet fully resolved. To what extent should one region be allowed to grow and accrue wealth at the expense of other regions? The growth of Southern California, more than any other region, has been subsidized with water drawn from and at the expense of much of the western United States. It is difficult to find any really good reason why the city of Los Angeles should have come into existence. However, the Padres found a suitable location for a mission, and with the mission, a pueblo grew. There was good soil for growing fruits and grains needed to support the small populace, and all around was abundant rangeland, suited to grazing of Spanish cattle. So the pueblo continued to exist after the mission had declined, a cow town in the middle of cow country. During the stormy days when California broke from Mexico, when the gold miners came, and when San Francisco boomed into a major city, Los Angeles remained a cow town. Its people and those of its hinterland were often out of step with the rest of the state. During the struggle for independence and then for admission into Union, their sympathies were mostly with Mexico. During the Civil War, when California went to the north, they were generally for the Confederacy. But the great drought of the 1860s put them out of the cattle business. The orange bonanza that had its start in the 1870s headed towards them a lead in agriculture. The completion of the Southern Pacific's and later Santa Fe's rail connection from the east to the south in the late 1870s and 1880s tied Los Angeles to the rest of the nation. Finally, the combination of climate and agricultural potential, when nationally publicized, started a flood of immigrants headed towards Los Angeles. This flood was never ceased for long, although there have been temporary interruptions to its flow. Consequently, Los Angeles became a city, then a metropolis, then a vast conurbation. With each stage of its growth, it has had to meet and overcome its greatest disadvantage, a lack of water. Southern California is noted for its warm sunshine. Warm sunshine, however, is associated here with the absence of rain clouds. The climate that brings people to settle is the same that denies them the water necessary for their support. The average rainfall at Los Angeles is 15 inches, but in some years less than 5, and in others more than 40 inches fall. It thus alternates between drought and flood. At San Diego, the rainfall averages less than 10 inches, but goes as low as 3 and as high as 27 in some years. Except for its mountains, Southern California has an arid or desert climate. But the mountains are high and steep. Mount San Jacinto towers nearly 8,000 feet above Palm Springs. The mountains gather rain but do not yield a steady stream flow to the lands below. Instead, because of their steep slopes, they give rise to sudden floods, followed by long summers when the streams run dry. When fires sweep through their brush-covered slopes, the soil from an entire mountainslide may slip down into the valley below. The coastal plain, however, is composed of deposits of gravel, sands, and other strata, capable of holding and carrying water. With infiltration from the mountains exceeding the rate of underground flow to the sea, a surplus of water was available when the country was first settled. Shallow wells brought forth water under artesian pressure, more than enough to supply the small population in the early days. Since the rain comes in winter when the crops do not grow, the first settlers found a need for irrigation to produce orchards, vineyards, and vegetable crops. The Spanish padres constructed the first irrigation works. Not the first. I think the Paiutes constructed irrigation works in eastern California, and that has been proven going thousands of years back. So these were the first European-built irrigation systems in California he's talking about. During the 1880s, a number of irrigation-based colonies sprang up at San Bernardino, San Gabriel, Pasadena, Anaheim, and Riverside. The community of Redlands made a major step towards full development of local water sources by damming up Big Bear Valley in the San Bernardino Mountains in 1884. Big Bear Lake was to become a major recreational area as well as a source for irrigation water. So Big Bear Lake is a reservoir. A further effort in the 1890s led to the development of the attractive Arrowhead Lake, or Lake Arrowhead, in another high valley. Soon all the local communities were drawing on and making full use of the mountain water supplies. By the 1890s, Los Angeles was becoming a city and had already exploited its local watershed and underground supplies thoroughly. In 1894, less than 8 inches of rain fell. Ooh. For the next 3 years, rainfall was below the average, and in 1898, reached a low of less than 5 inches. For the succeeding 6 years, until 1905, it remained below average. But during all this time, the city was growing rapidly. In 1903, a severe water famine hit. Consumption of water exceeded the recharging of the city's reservoirs, and only by drastic restriction on use was an actual catastrophe averted. During 1904, another severe crisis followed, and it became apparent that to maintain itself alone, even without further growth, Los Angeles would have to find a new source of water. At this time, the man in charge of the city's water was William Mulholland, a person with unusual vision and initiative. The city engineer, a personal friend of Mulholland, was Fred Eaton, who had long been familiar with the Owens Valley and had already investigated the possibility of bringing its water across the deserts to California. If you want to learn a little bit more about Mulholland and Eaton, please check out the movie Chinatown. It's a film noir with a young Jack Nicholson. Excellent movie. Goes into the story of how corruption brought water to Los Angeles. The Owens River drains most of the southern portion of the Sierra Nevada on the east side of the range. Towering above the valley are the highest peaks of the Sierra, peaks that gather moisture in even the driest years. The river flows through Inyo County's Owens Valley, and during historical times has emptied into Owens Lake, an alkaline desert lake from which the water evaporates once more into the desert air. Above the lake, however, the river flow permitted the existence of green and fertile lands. Originally, these were developed as livestock ranges, but by the time Los Angeles reached its first great water crisis, much of the flow of the Owens River has been used in the valley to support thriving farming communities based on irrigation. In 1902, the valley attracted the attention of the newly formed Reclamation Service, later to become the Bureau of Reclamation. Under the leadership of L.B. Lippincott, a friend of Fred Eaton, the Reclamation Service engaged in a survey of the irrigation potential of the valley, beginning in 1903. They found a suitable reservoir site at Long Valley, high on the Owens River, and apparently issued encouraging reports to the Inyo settlers about the future potential of their land. Into this hopeful atmosphere, however, the representatives of Los Angeles, Eaton and Mulholland, were to move in 1904. You guys may recognize Long Valley as the area just outside of Mammoth Lakes. The events of subsequent years are confused. The United States Reclamation Service, to the dismay and disbelief of the Inyo residents, suddenly issued a report stating that the proposed irrigation project for Owens Valley should not be developed. Los Angeles agents, including Fred Eaton, quietly purchased land throughout the valley, with Eaton acquiring the Long Valley Reservoir site. Against the protest of the valley residents, President Theodore Roosevelt backed up the Reclamation Service and further acted to extend the boundaries of the Inyo National Forest eastward. This protected from homestead entry land that might tie up further water within the valley and provided space over which the aqueduct of Los Angeles might pass. Wow, so they used National Forest acquisition to push ranchers out of these areas in order to acquire the water rights. So it's getting dirty, right? It's getting corrupt. In 1907, the city of Los Angeles voted on a bond that made possible the construction of the Owens River Aqueduct. 6 years later, after an incredible feat of engineering, this aqueduct was built by Mulholland's men across the Mojave Desert and through desert mountain ranges to pour water from the Owens River into the Los Angeles reservoirs in the San Fernando Valley, more than 200 miles away. To the disgust of the Inyo people, much of the water was not used initially to supply the needs of the city of Los Angeles, but went to irrigate the San Fernando Valley, where land that was once desert soared in value to $300 an acre or more, thus enriching those investors who had known in advance of where the water would go. You know about some rich people who invest when they get prior knowledge, huh? It was happening 100 years ago. Perhaps a crisis would not have developed had not a disagreement arisen between Eaton, who held the Long Valley Reservoir site, and Mulholland representing Los Angeles. Eaton asked $1 million for his property. Los Angeles refused to pay. No dam was built, no reservoir was filled. Los Angeles and the Inyo people competed for the uncontrolled flow of the Owens River. Myriad minor irritations added to the difficulties, and so the Owens Valley War was started. The first round was in August 1923 when armed citizens from the town of Big Pine prevented Los Angeles workmen from cutting off the Owens Valley irrigation ditch. From there, the progress towards the first dynamiting was direct. The Owens Valley struggle was not one of right against wrong, of white and black. There was justice on both sides and chicanery on both sides. The Valley people were motivated not just by a desire to maintain their homes, but by a desire to sell land at an inflated price. Personal profit motives spurred the activities of some city representatives. Eventually, a fairly amicable agreement was reached, but not until after many had been badly hurt financially and a lasting reservoir of ill will had been filled. Remy Nadeau in The Water Seekers marks one of the turning points in the struggle. The major disaster that struck Southern California in 1926. In that year, one of the hastily constructed dams built to hold Owens Valley water gave way. A flood roared down the San Francisco Canyon and into the Santa Clara River, crashing through several towns along the way. Before it reached the sea, 385 people had been killed and millions of dollars worth of damage to property had been done. In the aftermath of this disaster, and a period of some soul-searching, Los Angeles passed a $12 million bond issue to purchase Owens Valley land at peak prices. This quieted the conflict and assured once and for all that the water would come to Los Angeles. The Long Valley Dam was built, and a reservoir to be known as Crowley Lake, after Father Crowley, was filled. But by then, Los Angeles had passed through several more water crises, and it was necessary to extend their acquisition further north to tap the drainage of Mono Lake and bring these waters through the tunnels into the Owens River system. Fortunately, this was accomplished with more foresight, better manners, and without conflict. By 1941, in time for the Second World War, the Owens Mono system of water supply for the Los Angeles area was fully secured. By then, however, the entire supply was hopelessly inadequate for the city's needs. So Los Angeles is always chasing that water, it sounds like. The Ayers rock book actually goes on from what I was reading to talk about how miners and ranchers slowly pushed out the indigenous people from the best land. Owens Valley was not much of a desert until the water was rerouted. Before then, it was a very lush land. So a lot of things have been changed here in Eastern California, in the Mojave, in the Eastern Sierra, in order to serve coastal areas, specifically San Francisco and Los Angeles. And that's something that if you live on the coast in California, or if you live in any big city, it's important to think about where your resources come from. At least, in the very least, to have knowledge of where these things come from in the history. So I think that might be the end of my Mojave stories. Thank you, Elena, for complimenting the hat. It keeps the sun off of me out here in the desert. I don't like to wear sunscreen very much, so I try to wear a big hat. I think we'll try and end, if I have some battery left, with the story of He Seek the Skunk, as we always end. So I want to thank everyone again who's tuned in and who's viewing this, for being here for the Quarantine Bedtime Storytime, Volume 9, Mojave Edition. I appreciate you all listening, and it's very much a pleasure for me to share these stories. I hope it gives you something to think about, and I hope my context is not too confusing. It's really a lot of information to synthesize. So to put you all to bed, I'll tell the story of He Seek the Skunk. Oh, check out my YouTube when you guys have a chance. Just search Quarantine Bedtime Storytime. So I don't have the book, The Legends of the Yosemite Miwok, in front of me, so I'm going to try and tell you guys the story from memory. So, a long time ago, there was a village that had a chief named He Seek the Skunk. And that chief had a daughter who, when she got older, who did she marry? Oh, I want to get this animal right. I forget. She married a man who was an excellent archer. And Skunk knew this. And so he said to the husband, "Let's go on a hunt." Of course, the husband was a great archer. So the skunk said, "Let's go to the place here in the south with two peaks with a narrow pass in between them. This is the trail of Sokoi the elk. I will go, you stand here by the pass, and I will go down into the valley. I'll shoot my scent, and I'll scare the elk towards the pass, and then you shoot them." And so they did this. He Seek the Skunk shot his scent and scared all of the elk up into the pass. As soon as they had all passed, the husband of his daughter, his son-in-law, stood behind them and shot his arrow with such force that it killed all the elk. Of course, Skunk was so happy that he danced. He said to his son-in-law, "You killed all the elk, but I'm tired. So let's call the villagers to help pack everything, but I need you to pack one of the elk and carry me also, because I'm tired." So the villagers came and they packed the elk to bring it back to the village. His son-in-law hoisted an elk on his shoulder, and Skunk jumped on top. He said he was tired before, but he danced all the way back to the village on his son-in-law's shoulders. Skunk told the villagers, "If you will help me clean and dry the meat, I will give you some." So of course they went to work. They cleaned and dried the meat, they hung it to dry, and then they went to Skunk saying, "So we've done the work and we're here for our portion." Skunk turned suddenly and showed them his tail and threatened to fire his scent. And so they all ran away for fear that he would shoot his scent and kill them. So the next day, Skunk went to his son-in-law and he said, "Let's go back to the valley. Let's do as we did before and hunt elk." His son-in-law, getting a little bit wary, said, "Okay, let's go." So they did as before. Skunk went down into the valley and he shot his terrible scent. He scared the elk up through the pass, where his son-in-law stepped behind them and shot an arrow with such force it killed the entire band, just as before. Just as before, they called the villagers to help carry the meat. And Skunk said he was tired, so he danced on top of an elk on top of his poor son-in-law's shoulders all the way back to the village. Then, after the villagers had cleaned the meat and hung it up to dry, they went to Skunk again and said, "We're hungry. Can we have our portion?" He again turned as though he were going to fire and scared them all away. So the people didn't like this. They all got together and discussed, what are we to do? Must we always hunt for him and clean his meat and dry it for him and not get any always? Must we always eat acorn mush and peanut and no meat? And finally, an old wise man from the tribe said, Tuwik the badger said, we can kill him, but we must do it in a way where he cannot fire his scent to kill us. So Tuwik went to work. He began digging a big hole in the village. When the hole was built, he started a fire in the bottom. And the people asked him, Badger, what are you doing? And he said, don't you know? Skunk is a great dancer. He's a prideful dancer, and he likes to show that he's a good dancer. He likes to show off. We'll invite him over here. We'll cover over the hole with sticks and leaves, and we'll invite him to dance on top of it. And when he's dancing, he'll break through into the fire, and we'll kill him. To this, the people said, all right. So the people sent a messenger to Skunk's tent and said, or Skunk's wiki up and said, Skunk, we want you to do a dance for us. We'll pay you if you will come and show us a dance, for you are surely the greatest dancer in the village. Skunk was very prideful, of course, so he said, oh, of course, I'll come and dance. Where do you want me to dance? The people had covered over the hole. They pointed over and they said, we want you to dance right over here. So Skunk went to dance. He began dancing hard because, of course, he wanted to show the people what he was able to do, and he was prideful. So he danced harder and harder in the spot, and finally he fell into the hole. He broke through the sticks and leaves and fell into the burning coals. They burnt his feet so hard that he danced, but this time in pain. The people were ready for this. They had a giant boulder that they pushed over the hole when he fell in, covering it and sealing him in. Skunk was so mad at this that he shot his scent against the side of the hole, pushing up mountains on that side. Then he turned around and shot his scent so powerfully against the other side that he shot up mountains on that side too. Finally, he shot all his scent and died. Well, the people were no longer afraid that they were going to be shot and that their hard work was going to be exploited. So they had a feast, and they ate all the elk meat that they wanted. They were happy. So I hope the lesson in that story is pretty obvious. We need to work together to make sure that we're fighting greed in our society and make sure that we're taking care of each other.